Syria is soon to mark 10 years of war. Can you believe it? And while the fighting may have tapered off, the human suffering certainly hasn't. Nearly 12,000 children were killed or injured over the past decade in the conflict. And international aid agencies and the United Nations are warning that millions of Syrian children are still suffering from malnourishment, stunted growth, recurring illnesses and a lack of schooling. The UN's children agency, UNICEF, will today release a report detailing the devastating impact of the war on Syria's children. Ted Chaiban is UNICEF's regional director for the Middle East and North Africa. Ted Chaiban, welcome to Breakfast.
Hello, thank you.
Syria is about to enter its second decade of war. More than 6,000 children died in the conflict in the last 10 years, thousands more injured. There are still 6 million children in Syria. What is life like for most of them today?
I mean, for most children, they've reached the brink. The combination of the conflict, the economic crisis, and now COVID has driven them to the limit. We estimate that 90% of children in Syria need humanitarian assistance, so that's 6.1 million children. 80% of children in Syria are living below the poverty line. And what's important is to be able to continue to do everything possible so that they can stay in school, so that they can have psychosocial support, so they can have access to health services, to avoid losing a generation.
What about the psychological impact on the kids? So many of these children, I imagine, many of the 6 million would have been born into the conflict and spent their whole lives within it.
We estimate that nearly 5 million children who were born inside Syria since the war began have known nothing but war. And in the midst of COVID this year, we did a survey, a phone survey with families about what was on their mind, and what we saw was a doubling of concerns when it comes to psychosocial impact of that combination, conflict, the economy, and COVID on children. 1 in 4 children in Syria is in psychosocial distress, needing support. And that's why it's so important to continue to focus on learning, to give that sense of hope for the future.
And in terms of support for the kids in psychosocial distress, as you describe it, is school the answer? What about health support, health facilities? A lot of schools and a lot of hospitals, I think, both were destroyed over this decade of conflict.
Roughly 1 in 3 schools is not functioning, a similar number of health facilities. But there are still services, and it's important that those are sustained so that families, so that children can have access to the necessary services. Schools is a big part of the solution. Counseling, access to health services, including for COVID and COVID immunization. Those are all part of the response that the United Nations is managing in Syria. The UN as a whole is appealing for $9.8 billion for Syria and neighboring countries to respond to the crisis this year. UNICEF's total of that is $1.4 billion. We've had really generous contributions from a number of countries and private citizens, including from Australia. And with the resources, we can continue to provide that safety net for the population.
Well, this $9.8 billion you're saying is the call out for Syria. Last week on the program we were discussing, I think it was the call out for $3 to $4 billion for Yemen and the number of children on the brink of malnourishment and starvation, in fact, in Yemen. How big a problem is malnutrition there? I know you were in Syria recently. What did you witness?
I was in northeast Syria in December, and I think the primary concerns in Syria are around protection from being recruited, the psychosocial needs that we just mentioned, protection from even domestic violence under that combination of pressures. When it comes to nutrition, the food basket the cost of the food basket has increased by 230% of the last year as the economy has crumbled. So it is a real concern. We estimate 500,000 children are at risk of stunting because of malnutrition. But that's one of several needs that children have. And again, supporting the health system, supporting health centers, supporting the education system, supporting families with the cash transfers. Those are among the steps that can be taken to avoid the worst.
What's happening there on the ground with COVID? Obviously, COVID's complicated life for everybody, and when your life is already, so difficult, it's perhaps another unbearable layer. But what's the state there of the health support, of the spread of the virus, and the vaccine availability?
So there's been cases of COVID throughout the whole of Syria, but also in neighboring countries in Jordan and Lebanon, who host more than 2.5 million refugee children. And efforts to immunize these children, both inside Syria and out of Syria, or rather their families and eventually children, is underway. Inside Syria, the vaccines have not yet been deployed, but the agreements with the international facility COVAX to reach families in Syria has been concluded. And so the purchases will be made and the vaccines will begin to be deployed. In neighboring countries, so in Jordan and Lebanon, those governments have committed to immunizing refugees as part of their overall plan. And they both have bilateral agreements to bring vaccines in, but they're also relying on the COVAX facility. What's important is that we recognize as a world that no one will be safe until everyone is vaccinated, and that we move beyond vaccine nationalism so that countries like Syria, like Lebanon, like Jordan also receive their share of vaccine, that their frontline health workers are vaccinated, that their elderly and people with underlying conditions are vaccinated in the same order as richer countries are able to vaccinate their own citizens.
And just very briefly, I know you also visited the Al-Hol camp, the refugee camp in the country's northeast, where 22,000 children languish, including at least 40 Australian children. What is life like for them, just finally?
Al-Hol is a really precarious situation. It's dangerous. People live in flimsy tents in the midst of windswept plains. There are indeed over 7,000 foreign children living in the northeast of Syria, most of which are in Al-Hol. Their place is back home. We call on member states to take their citizens back home. They're not there because of a choice they made as children. And if there are juvenile justice procedures to pursue, those should indeed be in their countries of origin.
Ted Chaiban, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Ted Chaiban is UNICEF's Regional Director of the Middle East and North Africa.